In this video, we're going to factor something that is not a quadratic, but some way that you already know how to do. If you've been factoring by grouping using quadratics, you also know how to do this. So the first thing that we need to make sure that we do is we have to put our function in factored form, or excuse me, standard form. So we need to make this in standard form. So standard form is usually where we have our exponents of decreasing order. So let's look what we have here. We have a 3, a nothing, an equal, a 2, and then there's a 1 here. Okay? So that means that this here is going to be a degree of 3 because my highest exponent is 3. So for a degree of 3, my standard form would be ax cubed plus bx squared plus cx plus d. In this case I have an equals, so I'm going to write equals 0. So that's standard form. Notice how my exponents go down. 3, 2, 1, none. Okay. So that means that I have to do some algebra to get this in standard form before I can start to factor. Which means I'm going to subtract my x squared from the right side to bring it to the left. So this gives me x cubed minus x squared plus 1. Don't lose track of that equal sign. And I'm left with x on the other side. I need to move this x over to the other side of the equals, so I'm going to subtract x from both sides of the equal sign, and that's going to leave me with x cubed minus x squared minus x plus 1. Do not lose track of that equal sign. X minus x is 0. Okay? So right now, notice that I have an equation. So if I have an equation, I have to keep my equation. Right now I'm simply factoring, and we'll talk about solving later, but right now I just want to factor. So let's look at what we have. I have how many terms? I have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. So I have 4 terms. So when I have 4 terms, and it's already simplified, I can't combine anything, that means I'm going to look to see if I can factor by grouping. Notice this is not a quadratic. This here is a cubic. So let's write that down. This is not a quadratic. This is a cubic function. And it is a polynomial. It has 4 terms. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this here. X cubed minus x squared minus x plus 1 equals 0. So for the sake of factoring, I wrote it, but I'm going to ignore this here. I'm going to ignore this bit, and I'm only looking at my function. So if I have 4 terms, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split it into 2 groups. This should look very familiar to you because it's the same process that we used when we were factoring quadratics. Now I'm going to look on this side. What's a greatest common factor here? Well, the greatest common factor is x squared. So remember, I don't throw anything away. I'm going to pull that x squared out. I'm undistributing it. I'm going to write it in the front of parentheses. Then I'm going to divide x cubed by x squared, and I get x. And then I'm going to divide x squared by x squared, and I get 1, because that's a minus, it's a negative 1. Now I'm going to look here, and I'm going to ask myself, what's a common factor, greatest common factor that I can factor out of here? At first you might think there's nothing, but that's not true. Remember, this is -1. If my first term is negative, I always factor out a negative. I can factor out a -1 from both terms. I do not throw it away. I put it down here. Then I do my division. So -1x divided by -1 gives you x. 1 divided by -1 gives you -1. So if you notice, x minus 1 and x minus 1 is the same term, so I can divide that out. X minus 1, that gets divided out to the front, and what am I left with? I'm left with x squared minus 1. Okay, so I'm going to just bring this down so I don't forget it. So that's an equal 0. Okay. Now at first you may think that you are done, but you're not. So you have to recognize that this right here, that's the difference of squares. So we can do the shortcut with that. That's the difference of squares. This here is a quadratic. So I have to see if I can factor that, and because it's a difference of squares, I can. Sometimes when you do these, when you get to this step, you're done. In this case, we're not. So I am just simply going to copy down my first binomial, but I have to factor my second binomial. And if you remember the shortcut of a difference of squares, and you can only do it with difference of squares, you can take the square root of x squared. So the square root of x squared gives me x. So I'm going to put x, because x times x gives me x squared. And then I'm going to look at the square root of 1. Notice I ignored the sign. The square root of 1 is 1. So I'm going to put 1 and 1. Because I'm missing my center term, this has to be a plus and a minus. And again, let's not forget, we still have that equals 0. We're going to tag on at the end. Because I only asked you to factor, that there, those are my factors. So I have, those are my factors of x cubed minus x squared minus x plus 1. Those are the factors of that polynomial. So whenever you see 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4, you see if you can factor it by grouping.